पानी का भर के गिलास में आ रहा है।
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, at the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce Services Summit, we thank you all for joining us for this session, which is predominantly on how climate change mitigations can take place through renewable energy, or for that matter, renewable sources of energy. I may correct myself. If we all know that India is in the hub of climate change mitigation talks across the world, well, there are different parameters being touted where India says the per capita emission is the right measure for carbon emissions, while the world talks about that India being the third or the fourth largest emitter. So we have to see both sides of the coin. The fact remains that climate change hits everyone. And unfortunately, it hits the poorest of the poor most compared to all of us who are in the conferences and drawing rooms discussing climate change mitigations. This panel today is probably one of the most illustrious panel, which is having Mr. Upendra Tripathi, the ex-secretary of MNRE, and the former Director General of International Solar Alliance, architect of creating and leading International Solar Alliance to create a world body. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh needs no introduction. Probably one of the most renowned climate experts around the world, creating sustainable policies, both for energy, environment, and water. His organization, CEW, is in the forefront for any climate talk. And wherever there is climate change mitigation discussion, be sure that Arunabha will be there. And as Indians, we should be proud that he leads from the front on behalf of the India and on behalf of climate change mitigations. We also have Ashish Khanna, who is the president of Tata Renewables, part of the Tata Power, probably needs no introduction, but man who's leading a 5 gigawatt renewable portfolio of Tata Group and much more to come. And I would leave it to him to talk about the sustainable plans of Tata Group. We have Mr. Sunny Kumar, who is a digital technology specialist from Create Energy, Create Technologies, something which is going to change the landscape of how energy is used and how energy is measured and how data is captured. So we have a real variety of panelists, and it is my honor and pleasure to have and moderate this session. I would request Mr. Upendra Tripathi to please start the session, and I would have a few questions for him. And he can then be the keynote speaker for the session today. So, Mr. Tripathi, you have been at the forefront of changing the landscape of Indian power sector. First, as Secretary of MNRE, you embarked on a journey to fix a 175 gigawatt target, something which, including you and we, never believed, but almost on the cusp of achieving it. And then as DG of ISA to take the solar across the globe, do you think renewable targets alone can save the planet? And there is much more to sustainable development for climate change mitigations. And as one of the leading climate change thought leaders who has led ISA for so long. Please enlighten the audience with your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Sorry for bandwidth. I'll be in the audio mode. But as always, your questions are very soft. Will the targets solve the problem? Because many people say that India is putting targets like 175 gigawatt, 450 gigawatt, and that takes the world by surprise. Targets alone will not solve, not the subject that you have given. Is it the holy grail? No, I don't think this is the holy grail. 450 gigawatt for India is not a big thing. When we're talking about 450 gigawatt solar, obviously, you will take 1/3 of it or 1/4 of it as the actual installation that is going to come through. So looking at that, I'll say that targets are the driving force. When you make a policy, targets actually lead you towards that. If you remember 2015, when this 175 gigawatt came through, we asked the industry what exactly you want to have in policy. They came with a set of requirements, land, fiscal measures, financial measures, and all those things are translated into policy. And that is true of the 450 gigawatt also. But you also pointed out that today we're talking about a little about the green hydrogen and what is going to be the role of green hydrogen in this 450 gigawatt of solar. Now, in these two things, the only point I would like to make is that this 450 gigawatt itself requires, some sort of allocation. Because if you look at the mitigation front, climate change and sustainability, we are talking, everybody knows there is a climate crisis and everybody would like to address the issues of climate justice. Now, in climate literature, we call villain number 1, villain number 2, villain number 3, and villain number 4. Now, these are very usual terms when climate experts, talk to students or talk to other experts. Now, villain number 1 is, of course, energy sector. If you look at the global warming potential, 73.2% comes from energy sector. But within energy sector, energy generation per se is 24%. Transport is responsible for 16%. Energy use, 17%. Energy in agriculture, 1.7%. And of course, unallocated fuel combustion, 7.8%. So when we are talking energy sector, energy generation alone is not the issue to be addressed. These are the sub-sectors that we have to look into, because when we say energy sector is a villain for global crisis, global warming, we have different sub-sectors. And the 450 gigawatt, the new target, must address these subsectors. And I come to villain number 2, we call agriculture, forestry, and land use. As a whole, villain number 2 in climate crisis produces around 19% of global warming greenhouse gases. But there alone, we have to talk about livestock and manure, which is 5.8%, agricultural soils, management of soil, management of crop, 4.1%, rice cultivation, that accounts for 1.3%, crop burning, the thing that every year we talk about, and recently some scientists have found out that the black soot from Punjab takes 7 days, only 7 days to reach the Arctic. And the Arctic has great connections with the Himalayas. They call it the third pole. So, and when Arctic is affected, Himalaya is affected. When Himalaya is affected, monsoon is affected. And India's critical things are there at stop. So the interconnection between the Himalayas and the Arctic regarding the Gulf, the streams and the monsoon, that is very critical. And then we have talked about villain number 3, apart from the energy sector, the agriculture, and 3, the West. Now, West alone, globally, 3.2% of global warming comes from this. And then the landfills play a role, and wastewater, 1.3%. That is what comes from there. And the villain number 4 is, of course, industry per se. Whether we are talking about chemicals, we are talking about cement or steel, we are talking about other sectors where the global warming gases can be pinpointed, can be handled. So the point is that the 450 gigawatt project that we are talking about, it should not alone be confined to energy generation per se. It must address how this energy can reach out to these sectors, which I, of course, term as villains. But and the other thing that is very critical is that, we have today we have an obsession with CO2, and that is something, I'm very happy the International Solar Alliance is highlighting. We are all concerned with CO2. In fact, when there is a crisis, we make a ghost out of it, and everybody talks about CO2. But if you look at the constitution of global warming gases, the potential, the CO2, it is responsible for 55%. 45% comes from other gases. Methane, for example, nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, HFCs. So, but you will find very little attention towards the non-CO2 component. So when we make a narrative, and that is very critical, the narrative should be all inclusive. So India's 450 gigawatt, through ISR, it should bring out not only the role of how different sectors play a role, and how the 450 gigawatts should not be confined to only one sector, or how it can reach out to other sectors through maybe agro photovoltaics. But also it should bring out the role of methane globally, and how we can tackle the issues of nitrous oxide, sulfuric acids, sulfuric oxides, and we can also tackle the issues of chlorofluorocarbons, the HFCs. That is very critical. So to sum up, 450 gigawatt is not a holy grail. It's not a big thing for a country like India. And given the present efficiency levels and the technologies, it is actually, you can take 1/3 of it, and that's not a very big thing. But the new thing that should be brought with this 450 gigawatt target is the sectoral allocation, because we have to reach out to all the sectors for addressing the global warming crisis as a whole. And the other critical thing, the third point, is that if you look at the pandemic, for example, global warming will bring in a lot of crises, a lot of disasters, where disaster management will be critical. And if you look at the statistics at 2020, how, which are the countries who suffered most and where the solar installations came down, India is one of the countries where actually it came down drastically, almost by 49%, the investments came down. So the point there is that, the global pandemic, it doesn't affect all countries equally. It affects different countries in different ways. So that has to be kept in view. And the last point is about, along with 450 gigawatt and the net zero emission issues, India is also talking about climate justice. The per capita, generation of global warming potential by different countries. And there India, of course, will be 10th, not 3rd, USA, China, and India. If you take per capita, India will come to a position of 10th. And it has a whole lot of policy implications globally. And this 450 gigawatt of India comes with a package. And ISA, of course, I'm the ex-DG, so I'm not the right person to talk about ISA right now, but ISA is one of the brilliant creations of India. And it's going to solarize all the sectors, and when hydrogen comes in, of course, there are a number of issues of, challenges about transportation, about price, but even when green hydrogen comes and dominates, solar is going to be the midwife to get generation, to generate hydrogen through electrolysis and actually bring in another channel of support for global warming potential to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tripathi. That was quite a thing. So we all know the 4 villains, right from Prem Chopra to Gulshan Grover. And I would like to move on to, I will come back to you, Dr. Tripathi. I have some more questions for you. But let me get back to Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Arunabha, you heard out Mr. Tripathi now. Climate change is an issue which is bothering us all. And who would know better than you? There have been many conferences, there have been many discussions, many panels. But the fact remains is a lot of work has been done. A lot of policies have been made. It's not that the world has been just sitting idle. Yes, a lot of work has been done. But is that enough? That is my first question to you. Renewables today, as a part of the climate change mitigation, anyway has done its work by becoming probably the cheapest source of power. And therefore, it is making economic sense for all the utilities to deploy renewables. So it is serving a dual purpose. a lower cost of energy, as well as mitigating the climate change. But it is also a fact that the people who are most impacted by the climate change, the poorest of the poor, still do not have access to electricity and still are not a part of a movement of climate change. The climate change movement today is in the drawing rooms and in the conferences and in the government to government and business to business levels. But that people's movement, which is required, is still not there. And I don't remember that you have spoken somewhere that a people's movement is required. What, according to you, we should be doing in terms of, one, as Mr. Tripathi says, that 450 gigawatt is not a holy grail. I would want to have your views. And what beyond this needs to be done for the balance 50% of the climate change villains? Because I don't think so that comes up so much in discussion as much as power comes into discussions.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Jain, and my greetings to everyone who's listening in on this important session. Let me start by responding to your very first question: have the actions that have been taken enough? And I would argue that definitely not. In a few days, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will come out with its next report. It will highlight once again that we are way off target in terms of the kinds of emissions reductions that we need to have to keep the planet on a sustainable pathway. As we look to the future, we also have to look to the past, because it's the inactions of the past that are going to determine the pathways of the future. This week, my organization, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, has released the first of its kind analysis ranking every single developed country in the world in terms of their actions with regards to their pre-2020 commitments. And let me just give you one simple number. As opposed to the requirements that the developed world would reduce emissions by up to 18%. In fact, the IPCC had suggested up to 25% by 2020 against 1990 levels. The developed world overall has actually overconsumed 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent over and above what was allocated to them. That effectively amounts to half of the entire world's annual GHG emissions. It amounts to 7 times India's annual emissions. This is a carbon budget that has been oversubscribed by the developed world. Now, as a result, when we look to the future, we have to then think about not just the pathways that the developed world is setting for itself in terms of net zero targets, but also who's going to take on the burden of all this overconsumption that has happened in the past. And that's where the sectoral strategies, but also a grander narrative has to come in. I would argue that grand narrative should be centered around what I call a deal for development. We cannot have action for climate change unless we bring climate matters and investments in climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage right to the center of our economic policymaking. And it's not going to happen unless we think of it sector by sector in terms of what it means in terms of new ambitions and new targets and new opportunities that arise. Let us unpack this a little bit. Let's start with the 450 gigawatt target for India itself. Our estimation at CEW is that with 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, it would amount to an emissions intensity reduction of 54% by 2030, which is well above the 33 to 35% that India has promised under the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. But emissions intensity reduction is not the same as emissions reduction, and therefore more has to happen. So I would argue that the next big villain, the industrial emissions, has to be targeted. Now, how do you target industrial emissions? You have to look at the high intensity heat that is required in blast furnaces, that manufacture steel, or the furnaces that manufacture cement, or ammonia, or petrochemicals. These 4 sectors alone account for 3/4 of our industrial emissions. Now, Mr. Tripathi mentioned green hydrogen, and I think it will be a foundational fuel of the future, but it is not cost competitive right now. So, as part of that deal for development, I would argue that we should have a global green hydrogen alliance. Why do I say this? It's because right now, no country has really cracked the green hydrogen technologies, even though some have done a lot more than others. In a report of mine that will come out in a few weeks, I analyzed more than 32 countries that have some kinds of hydrogen programs going on. There are 10 alliances that have been promoted by individual countries, but only to promote their individual interests. What that means is you're not able to tap into the opportunities of pooling resources and lowering down the costs of electrolyzer technologies faster than any individual country can do on its own. What is worse is when I look across the world, across these bilateral partnerships, Asian countries are almost entirely missing, barring Japan, which has always had a big play on hydrogen. But Asia is where the highest demands for hydrogen will come from. And therefore, we have to find a new networked international platform that brings the technology developers and the technology demanders and those in between to pool their resources, establish the safety protocols and standards, to lower the costs of the electrolyzers, to look at alternative materials for the membrane technologies, to bring down effectively the prices of green hydrogen, which can then serve as a fuel for green steel or green ammonia. And India could become one of the export hubs for something like green ammonia. One more component of this deal for development has to be finance. And I know Mr. Khanna will be speaking immediately after me. And it's absolutely critical that we continue to reduce the cost of finance for investing in clean technologies in the emerging markets. In a recent study of mine called the Emerging Markets Leapfrog, we find that actually, barring China, there has been a peak or a plateau across all emerging markets in terms of fossil fuel demand. Now, there might be some spikes in terms of that demand in the coming years, but effectively, the game is over for coal. And yet, the very countries where you will have the maximum growth in electricity demand are also the countries which pay the highest for the costs of finance. That is a very large share of the tariffs. So we need a risk pooling mechanism to reduce the costs of hedging against those risks. And that has to happen across countries in order to bring the costs down. One more important sector, Mr. Tripathi talked about agriculture, I would expand it to the rural areas. Across the world, more than 100 million people have gone back into poverty because of the pandemic. And as countries, rich or poor, look to come out of this disastrous humanitarian and economic situation, we have to look at what will be the new opportunities in rural areas. And again, we find that in India alone, we have a more than $50 billion opportunity in using distributed clean energy for powering livelihoods, not just powering up lights and fans and huts, but powering livelihood applications in India's rural areas, on farm and off farm. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have an opportunity that is upwards of $12 billion. So can we power livelihoods globally by creating a public-private philanthropic platform that uses patient capital to support these startups that can then create literally millions of micro-entrepreneurs in rural areas and bring the energy transition closer to people, as you were saying, Mr. Jain. And finally, this response in terms of the deal for development requires an insurance cushion against climate shocks. In your remarks, you have talked about climate change impacting the most vulnerable. We find, as we develop the developing world's first detailed climate risk atlas here in India, we find at CEW that 3/4 of our districts are already hotspots for extreme weather events, floods, droughts, cyclones. 40% of our districts are now showing trends of switching from being drought prone traditionally to becoming flood prone or vice versa. So we need an insurance cushion against systemic climate shocks. But that insurance cushion does not exist. Globally, uninsured losses against extreme weather events are upwards of 60%. This can overturn the entire global insurance industry. And yet, if you look at the existing mechanisms, last year after the pandemic, Wimbledon, a tennis tournament, got $141 million from its pandemic insurance bonds. All low-income countries got $132 million. A tennis tournament got a bigger insurance payout than hundreds of millions of people in all low-income countries. This kind of inequity is not just unjust, it is sheer madness. Because when a perfect storm of shocks, whether it's a public health crisis, an agricultural crisis, an extreme weather event crisis hits us, it is our fiscal budgets that get impacted. It is our macroeconomic situation that gets impacted. It's those supply chain constraints that result in inflationary pressures, combined with no growth. So we are ending up in a stagflation. So we don't have to care about the planet. We don't have to hug a tree to realize that creating an insurance cushion, a global reserve fund against climate shocks, is not just sensible for the planet, it's sensible for the people. So that's that deal for development that I propose for you, that looks at hydrogen and technology co-development, that looks at reducing costs of finance, that brings the energy transition closer to people by powering up rural livelihoods using distributed clean energy, and that creates an insurance cushion with a global reserve fund against climate risks. If we began to expand our horizons, then we'll stop thinking about just a track on mitigation or adaptation. We'll stop just raising our rhetorical flags in climate negotiations and get serious about the problem at hand. Thank you.
Thanks. That was great, Arunabha. Don't go away. I have a lot of questions for you. But before that, I would like Ashish Khanna, the president of Tata Renewables, to come in. Ashish, you're a part of a group which prides itself into sustainable development in all their businesses, what they do. They are one of the leading renewable developers and installers. What, according to you, are the key risks you believe in India achieving that 450 gigawatt target? Question number one. Number two, how do you think the grids get impacted if we do not do any mitigation measures for the grid stability and capturing the variability of the renewables in some form or the other? And number three, you all know that what happened to the California grid last year and this year. We are having collapses of California grid at least twice a year. And that is when they've just woken up to say that, okay, we cannot handle more than what we have already installed till such time we have large-scale battery storage plants. So what, according to you, would be a solution for India if we were to achieve that 450 gigawatt in the next 7 to 8 years? And number three, being the largest distributed solar player, why it is that we are still lagging behind? And when Arunabha says that that is the key to climate change mitigations in the 500 districts which are going to get impacted if we do not deploy distributed solar or distributed energy in some form or the other.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, good evening to all. I think what Dr. Tripathi, after Dr. Tripathi and Dr. Anurag, there is very little for me to contribute in the whole process. It has been articulated very well. I have few pointers, just trying to respond to the questions which you have asked. You know, important factor which we have to look out here, that I was also going through certain studies and realized that if you look at the last 2 decades, natural disasters, directly or indirectly impacted by the climate change, Number 1 country, US, number 2, China, number 3, India, number 4, Philippines. I'm just trying to give you a perspective that natural disasters are not limited to a particular set of countries depending on their GDPs. It impacts us all. The challenge which we have out here is that those countries, which are number 3, number 4, has very little with them as a resources to do much about it once the disaster has impacted us. We get all the optics of California disasters or the cars floating like fishes on the roads in China and all those things. But the fact remains, we are going to be hit very soon. It could be sooner than later. I do agree that COP21 or COP26, no matter what we call it across, when the report will come, we all have our own projections. We are far away from reality. Are we acting like an ostrich with our head in the sand that no one is around us? Or we are really doing something about it is a larger question. Energy has always been politics, and so now is the climate change. It has also made with the politics out there. Taking the politics out and looking at the 450 target, I think 450 was very similar as a target what we have heard a few years back of 175. We all have our own questions asked about in various forums whether this 175 by 2022 is possible or not. We have sat across in various discussions 4 years back, even when Dr. Tripathi was heading the MNRE, and we used to say what is required for it and what is not. I think it is more directional in nature. I won't hold the number in place, but what we are looking at is that growth which we are targeting towards, is it possible, feasible, required, or we are just playing for optics? I think the challenge remains that India, with the potential of renewable energy, is very blessed. If you look across even solar and wind, and I'm taking away the ocean and the other part of it, we are in excess of 1,000 gigawatt plus, the potential itself, as I talk about. So we have the potential in place. Is it a holy grail or not is a larger political question. But the good part is that unlike the fossil fuel, I have the potential within the country to exploit these resources which are available with us. The second good thing about it is that you are never late in this industry. When I look at renewable as an industry, technology keeps on upgrading itself. Cost effectiveness in the last 6 to 7 years, we have seen 85% of the reduction of even a simple thing like a panel. And it is not because of any other thing, but it is primarily because of the scale as well as the technology interventions which has happened. So we are well placed to take full advantage whenever you enter into this race. You can, even if we are late, it is fine. We have made a phenomenal progress from 4 gigawatt in 2014. Now we are touching around 36 to 38 gigawatt in solar, and wind has also grown on that part. So directionally, we are right, not holding the numbers. The challenge which is coming up is that till date, the renewable is not impacting the grid, because the grids are relatively designed for a power where this sort of infirm power is not going to greatly impact us. Grids are overtly impacted by the demand side rather than the supply side today. That's how we are in the current context. Is this 450 gigawatt going to change the dynamics? Of course, it's going to change the dynamics. I think it is not a matter of the grid. It is a matter of how are we going forward towards it. You have cited an example of California. I think what's my personal learnings on it? There could be better players on that. My personal learnings is that we are only nowadays working on what I call from a design perspective at the end, at the top end of that design parameters is where we are working. There is no margin of error out there. And my factor of safeties doesn't exist nowadays in whatever I'm doing. Whether I'm building a solar project, whether I'm building a wind project, a hybrid project, the tariffs we are quoting compared to what we are infusing, that margin of error doesn't exist. And when we are actually dealing with the infirm power by nature, how can I just take that away? That's what has happened in California. We have, as per my view, we have overtly dependent on the surety that imports will happen. The gas plants will come out in some stage, and no one really realized that Some of them have just been shut off. The grid imports were assumed that whenever I need, it will come. On those particular days, on a Friday and a Saturday evening, if I recollect well, there was a demand surge. The supply was not there at all. And you have fires coming across at most of the places. I think that demand surge is something which is a lesson for us from India, that are we going to do the same thing which the Western world has done? Or I have working for a different country for their demands. Another thing which we should be very conscious of the fact that while I can cite examples of California, we are in India and I need energy for my growth, for my economic growth. My per capita consumption is 1/3 of the world average today. So am I have to do things to enhance this energy consumption so that my per capita increases? There is always a question about how much of energy is required for it, or it has a direct correlation with the GDP growth. But in the current context we are in, for next 1 decade for sure, on for this decade, we need energy for our GDP growth. We can't take it away. What's the best source of energy we have? Of course, renewable. We have been taking full advantage of it. But can renewable on its own can do it? I think we need to work towards it for next 3 decades. I need to have a storage. And where is my storage today? Today, I have a coal-based economy as well as my whole energy segment is concerned. It's going down. A company like us, you have specifically asked me to talk about our ESG. We have openly, clearly, Tata Power, a 104-year-old company, has built up the largest thermal project in this country, has clearly stated its carbon neutrality by 2050 for sure, if not earlier. So, these commitments are not just for compliances and for optics. We are working towards it. So at the end of the day, if that is where the trend is in 3 decades, we are going to be carbon neutral. What is going to come up to take this infirm power and make it a firm power? At the end of the day, we need 24/7 power for all these places. I think that's the larger question which we are not addressing today. You mentioned about, we happen to be number 1 in rooftop, but what is when Dr. Tripathi was at the helm of affair, in that 175 gigawatt, 100 gigawatt was solar. And out of that 100 gigawatt, if Dr. Tripathi, I remember 40 gigawatt was rooftop. I am not even 1/10 of it as we speak about 6 or 7 gigawatt. And not that we don't know the reasons. We all know why it has not percolated out there. The challenge is we are not doing much about it. And second point, which Dr. Anubhav also mentioned about, do we really need distribution generation? Of course. We today have the technology in place. What is this pandemic has shown us? And I think even still, if we don't take these lessons into consideration, then even the ostrich are better in many manners. I have seen that there is a migration which has happened. Energy is required at that particular place. I cannot be completely dependent on imports, whether it is imports of goods or it is imports of services. We have seen it, how a virus can impact it, leave aside the other destruction which is possible. Does it not mandate us to think back on what is the best for us, or it is only the optics which matters, or the optics of the large projects which matters as well as their tariffs are concerned? I think both are required. Where I don't have a grid, why don't I invest in a distributed generation? Tata Power per se, we have been working on microgrids very successfully and has a huge target of 20,000 by the end of this decade. But what we are looking forward for this, for 10,000 for that matter, what we are looking forward for this is this distributed generation is cost effective, is absolutely cost effective, and gives a 24/7 power for us to develop those area economically and also have the health and other parameters required for this country without impacting the climate today. Let's not forget the fact that a large number of carbon is also emitted when I am burning certain fuels. We are only talking about coal out there, but there are many biofuels which I am also burning across for my crops, which Dr. Tripathi gives an example, but otherwise too, which is impacting the environment and the climate very adversely. We don't speak about it, but that can also be minimized if I have a distributed generation out there. What is required to be done is, I think a simple parameter, which is very simple out there, is we need to prioritize ourselves. What is important for us at one stage? Growth, yes. Growth at what cost is a question which we need to solve. Do we need to grow like what the Western countries have grown in the last 50 years and try to just copy that? Or I have a solutions today, and all of us have solutions today for what is needed in this country. Whether it is distributed generation, we can produce power at that stage, having more entrepreneurs in place, bringing those storage solutions, which is good for us. Do I have to live for only lithium ion in my life because that's what is the optics of Teslas of the world? That's nothing wrong out there. But can I not work on a pump storage system? Can I not work on a biomass system, which I have immense potential in this country, and then try to use that storage out there? I'm not saying which those technologies should not work. All I'm trying to say is that if I have a policy initiatives today for us to support these sort of solutions coming up, then I think we are much better placed. And then while 450 can still be met, I think if we meet those renewable requirements for climate change and for the economic upliftment of our country, which is also very important, and give them an energy source which is reliable, which is continuous, and also it is distributed, because then I don't have to invest a lot of capex in it. We have a right solution and we all know about it. The only challenge is we need to have a policy framework which should help. So some of it is definitely there. I'm not taking away the fact that we have achieved immensely well. None of us would have actually believed at that particular time of 2014 that we are going to be 100 gigawatt in renewable by this frame. Let's be honest about it, of our achievement. But having reached this far, I think for thus far, we need to have a clarity in place. You asked me a question about the ESG front. I think important factor, which is also very important, is what we do. I can share it across with you. You know, the purpose of business is to serve the society, is imbibed in all of us. And that is very important from a corporate standpoint, that when we are doing business, you take this into consideration, that is it going to help the society? And then in what way you can help the society in that manner. The second point I think, which is very important, is your business aligned with your goals, objectives on the ESG front, or ESGs are just for compliances? It's not tick here. So what we have, and the third, which is also very important factor, is do I have an intermittent goals, or I'm just looking for 2050 as my goal post? I will do it by 2050. Don't ask me any question. Let's not review ourselves in between. I can tell you in this organization, we have, after every 2 years, we look at how we have achieved. Like very good examples have been given otherwise too. Are we there? And if we are not there, what do we have to do to reach there? Then the business is completely aligned with it. Then you need to have successes even on a short-term basis. Like I can share with you a simple example of a mahashir, which was going to be an extinct fish. We took an initiative in our dams, and today it is out of that red list. Gives us the confidence that even those small things which we are going to do, the CSR, you know, today when we talk of renewables, why are we taking away the fact that renewable comes at areas which are absolutely backward otherwise? There is a great opportunity for each one of us through our CSR to uplift them, upgrade them, bring the technology so that I have a sustainable solution for energy and for economic needs and for my business too. It's a great opportunity for each one of us, which I think in Tata's, we are very clear in our objectives out there. And that's how we progress.
Great. Thank you, Ashish. That was a great insight what you gave us. You talked about technology, and here we have, I move over to Sunny, and I want to ask him, see, Sunny is a part of a software company and a technology. Technology, I believe, is going to be the key player for renewables, energy in any form, including distributed energy, which Ashish talked about just now. In fact, I see a day, at least in my lifetime, for sure, where you'll have virtual power plants storing green energy on clouds and getting me energy on my tap of my mobile that, okay, I need 20 kilowatt from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. and some green energy will flow into my house. Also, when we supply green energy to the corporates, you know, we talk about C&I, the blockchain can play an important role. Smart meters, another important role. So Sunny, can we have you here and understand what type of support or development is taking place and how blockchain and other technologies can enable the deployment of renewable energy in a more efficient manner?
Okay, sir. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So, sir, first of all, we are discussing here our 450 gigawatt target of renewable energy. Even in my working experience with the utility right now, whatever the renewable energy penetrating into the grid, they find it very difficult. In fact, it's becoming a nightmare for them to managing all those renewable power into the system. I can say that the renewable power generation curve of renewable power is entirely different from the conventional one. We depend upon the weather parameter for all these generations. So there is a need of ours that we should implement machine learning based system, artificial intelligence based system in our utilities that helps the utility person in taking the decision support system. And in a way, only a single tool like generation forecasting will not solve the purpose. Ashish sir has also mentioned that there is a problem in the demand side also. So we need an integrated system of demand and renewable generation forecasting both, where in advance we can estimate that how the power is gonna flow and how much the demand will be. Accordingly, that the grid operator can take appropriate action. Sir, you have asked about the blockchain also. So right now, off-grid solutions are getting implemented through the blockchain. But so far as we have seen in India, we in utility sector, basically, we are at very niche stage of technology deployment. It's a high time to enhance the speed of technology implementation and catch up with the RE penetration. Yes, new exchanges are also coming up, and the blockchain technology will serve the purposes. Off-grid purpose of the real-time reconciliation, distributed ledgers, this all can be done through the blockchain technologies. Even all those, the securities of the data and readily availability of the data means factually correct data can be available to all the clients through this blockchain. Right now, we are totally relying on certain websites for all these data, and API integration is very less in our country. So there is a need of ours that everything has to be integrated. Then it will be possible to handle such a huge amount of renewable energy in our grid. So this is my insight from technology point of view.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you so much. I want to come back to Arunabha Ghosh. Arunabha, you talked about a global hydrogen alliance. And when we talk about green hydrogen, I have been also working on the green hydrogen right now. And my biggest concern is water. How do we, if we have to have large scale green hydrogen deployment, today we are at 6 million tons of hydrogen in the country, which is gray or blue, whatever you want to call it. It's generally gray. But if we shift to green hydrogen, hydrogen needs a purified form of water. We are already a country which has got scarce waters in one part and ample water in another part, where to the extent that we get floods. The water tables are extremely deep now. The agriculture sector has been digging deeper and deeper. So how do you think the green hydrogen may solve one problem but create another one?
Absolutely, Mr. Jain. There is no question that we have to look at all of these as wicked problems, you know, when you solve one part and you create another. But this is exactly why I'm saying that we need to have an alliance where we pool the resources to try and solve for different parts of this problem. Today, if you have a steel plant coming up in Sweden using green hydrogen, well, they're going to tap all the water that's there in the Nordic countries, right? It's not a problem. But, you know, they can develop the best technology but there is barely any demand. We are going to go from 150 million tons of steel today to 200, 300 million tons of steel in the next 2 decades, right? That's where the steel manufacturing is going to happen, right? So, and then we have to ask ourselves, will Indian steel, the way it is currently made, right? While we have very, very efficient plants, including owned by Tata Steel, right? When the standards change somewhere else, will we be able to export blast furnace steel made in India in Europe in another 2 decades? And my answer would be almost certainly not. Will we be able to sell internal combustion engine cars in 1.5 decades from now? We will not be able to do so. Will the steel used in those cars come from blast furnaces or from shaft furnaces? See, as you realize that it's your entire supply chain that's going to get disrupted, you have to then realize that it is exactly for this reason that an alliance is needed. An alliance does not mean a brick and mortar big building where everything is happening. It's about matching what is needed versus where the potential lies. In some place, you might have great renewable energy potential for running the electrolyzers 24/7. In another place, it might be water availability is better. In a third place, it might be better, safer storage. So you have to develop the protocols and safety standards for the transportation. And it's all actually going to be happening in the Asia Pacific, or I would say the Indo-Pacific. Australia, Japan, India, 3 out of the 4 members of the Quad are here. And then across on the other side of the Pacific is the United States, right? So it's countries like that, such as this, that have to come together. And when we say we need to reduce the cost of the electrolyzer, add a parameter to that. Add a parameter that we also need to reduce the water footprint, right? Why does the membrane technology only have to rely on something that DuPont has? Why can't we have alternative membrane technologies, right? So this is, if we do this only in our own respective silos, we will never be able to develop the technology at scale. And we will end up having trade disputes on hydrogen rather than collaborations on hydrogen. So I don't have a technical solution for you today, but I'm providing for you an idea of how you structure an alliance like this that puts these parameters of cost reduction, safety, transportation, water footprint reduction, and so forth. And I'm quite certain that we can get there if we followed those collaborative approaches.
One last question to you, Arunabha. I observe that we are in a vicious circle while we have climate change and it is impacting the renewable generations. We have seen it last year for wind. We are seeing it for solar this year. When we talk about net zero, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day, it has to be in energy terms, not in capacity terms. We must generate because energy is going to be consumed in kilowatt hours, not in capacity. The fact remains is, even if I deploy and if my generation falls by 10, 15, 20% because of climate change, my target goes further down the line. So do we have a solution for this? Is it that a faster deployment rather than targets which are there at 2030 should be preponed to 2027? Or are there any other measures which we need to take? Because this phenomenon is happening globally. It's not only confined to it.
No, first of all, yes, indeed, mitigation measures have to be deployed faster. As I said, you know, if we've gone and consumed 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, already excess of what the developed countries were supposed to emit, the pie is becoming smaller and smaller. So the sooner we do it, the better. Why? Because climate change, just like as I say, energy is measured in kilowatt hours. Climate change is a consequence of the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? So for every ton that is still going into the atmosphere, we're adding to the compounding problem there. And many parts of the world are reaching those tipping points. Mr. Tripathi talked about the Himalayas and the Arctic, right? When the Arctic starts demonstrating 3 times faster warming than the rest of the world on average, it is impacting not just the ice melt in the Arctic. It is impacting the pace of the jet stream. It is impacting the wind flow patterns. It is impacting the way in which the monsoons arrive and so forth. So whether you're looking at hydropower, whether you're looking at wind power, all of that begins to get impacted. So accelerating mitigation actions is absolutely critical in order to try and buffet against some of the challenges that are arising. But that said, I would argue, and Mr. Khanna in his expansive presentation laid out many different approaches that we are not tapping into, right? It does not have to be just solar and wind. It does not have to be only battery storage. There is a lot of other potential that we have to be tapping into, and then looking at what's my ideal 24/7 round the clock supply that is reliable and that is also profitable, because as he said, the margin of error is not just small, it is absent. Right? So let us look at our policies in terms of that respect, that no longer just solar, no longer just wind, no longer just a bioenergy mission. We want round the clock, clean power, affordable and accessible to all. That should be the mantra. Technology neutral. And then let the companies bid against that kind of a requirement. And then let's see what kind of innovations, competition, etc. kicks in. That would be my suggestion. You are the industry experts, you would know better.
Excellent. Coming to Mr. Tripathi. Mr. Tripathi, you talked about one of the villains is gas emissions. Air conditioning is going to be one of the key villains. But the fact remains is there is a global warming, and warming to the extent that we saw people dying in Canada, one of the coldest countries on the planet. And therefore, I talked to my friend in Canada, and he said there were air conditioners and fans being sold in black market. Now, if by 2050, there is a study that the total air conditioning demand will go up by 5 times what it is today. 5 times. So even if you have done mitigation on that, but if the total demand goes up 5 times, would you be back to square one, or do we need to find some new technologies again?
Sunil, that's a good question. Before I go to that, 2 things I would I like the Arunava's idea about a global hydrogen alliance. But I remember in 2015, I had sent one advisor, Mr. Dusa, with an application to have the headquarters of Global Hydrogen Alliance or something in New Delhi along with ISA. But they decided not to put it in India. So that thing, you can have a look. And the other thing, related to, Canada, I in fact told that in 2020, how the impact of COVID has not been symmetric among all countries. For example, if you look at China, it added 66% more compared to 2019 in solar installations. USA, 99%. Germany, 22%. And if you look at Vietnam, it added 142%.
Vietnam was an outlier.
Now, the only countries who went negative, Japan, 9%, India, 47% minus, Italy, 4%, Australia, 5%, and Spain, of course, 33%. So the point is, when you're talking about Canada and the, high temperature now, this is actually the asymmetric impact of global warming on various countries. But, there is no problem in the demand growing up to 5 times what we have now. In fact, they have something called 5x competition, making ACs 5 times more energy efficient. And even the refrigerants that we are using, the 5th generation, CFCs, SCFCs, HFCs, and now going back to actually global warming neutral refrigerants. And that is the Kigali Amendment is all about.
We're just finishing on
that. And so the world needs, of course, to hit the Kigali Amendment and make sure that as our demand grows in the cooling sector, it is not merely the cooling of the residential things that we are talking about. We have a great potential demand in the agricultural sector for cold storages. And if our agriculture has to go for a transformation, we need cooling. And so keeping all these things in view, we are not going to contain the demand, but we are going to attack in 2 fronts. A, in the front of energy efficiency, which is critical, and B, in terms of the refrigerants that are coming up in the lab.
Thank you. I have a pressure from the organizers. We are running out of time. This debate can go on. And with Arunabha, Ashish, and Dr. Tripathi and Sunny, we could have spent another hour. I must thank you all for being here and enlightening us. Probably if we could even do 10% of what we have spoken today, we would have a better world and a better planet for our generations to come. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Jain.
Thank